In this section, we're going to be going over the V-Ray skin shader, and this V-Ray skin shader is essentially a really nice subsurface scattering shader with 3 different levels of subsurface scattering that are blended together. It's one of the new shaders that V-Ray, that Chaos Group has put into V-Ray 3.0, and it's really an amazing step forward for any character work you're going to be doing. This model that we're going to be looking at today, I do want to give a plug to my good friend Rafa Zavala and show you his website real quick. He's graciously provided us with this model. It's actually his father-in-law, and you can check him out at rafazabaladigital.com, and also his ArtStation has all sorts of amazing stuff on it as well. You can recognize Azog. He made that at Weta, and also Luca from Planet of the Apes. So really amazing guy, and we're very happy to have his model, or his demo. So if we look at this scene real quick that we're going to be working in today, what we've got going on is a V-Ray proxy for the mesh, some eyeballs, and then essentially just 2 main light sources. We have a very large softbox that's acting as our key light, and then we have this V-Ray rectangular light directly behind the character that's our rim light. Whenever I'm dialing subsurface, I do like to have some sort of strong backlight like this, especially with a character, so I can really see how the deep kind of backscatter, usually the red in the skin and stuff, is reacting. So in this case, if we pull that render back up, you can see, I can definitely see a really nice glow happening in that ear, which is what I want. This is still a work in progress. Doing a full character like this takes a lot of time, but I'm actually hoping to do a lot more work to this in the future. So let's take a look at this shader. Let's open up a fresh node editor here, and we'll create a V-Ray skin material. So as I was saying, we have 3 levels of subsurface that are blended together. So if you're used to the old Mental Ray skin shader, this will look very familiar. We have our shallow, mid, and deep. Also in other shaders, that's going to be labeled as epidermal, dermal, and also then the deep scatter is the hypodermis layer. So they may be referred to as different things. But the default values are pretty nice as well. They definitely come in. We can actually just assign this and just take a peek at what the default values look like. And let's go ahead and look through. Let's go through our camera. And for that render, I actually had some depth of field turned on. So for our test renders, I am going to go into my render settings and turn that back off again. Cool. And we can go ahead and turn on our IPR. The V-Ray skin shader does IPR, which is wonderful. And we should immediately be able to see some feedback here. You can also choose to, in this case, I do have some shaders on the eyes that are going to be pretty heavy. So I can also go in and it actually seems like it's reacting pretty nicely, so I can just leave it for now. But if you're ever IPRing something pretty intense like this, like subsurface, you may want to go in and hide some of your other objects that may be reacting against that. So you can see here, if we look over at our shader, there's the same general subsurface properties at the top, where we have a scale, maximum SSS. Also, this is new. We have a max reflection amount. If you want to dial this stuff up and down globally without having to go in and change these one by one. And then we also have an opacity if you need that. We have our diffuse section, which can be helpful in situations where you need to control the amount of subsurface in certain areas. For example, the forehead or the nose, these areas where there's a lot of bony forms in a character, you may actually want to go in and specifically reduce the amount of subsurface and just simply dial in diffuse instead. If I draw a little render region here, you can see that the diffuse amount just like the other subsurface slider, is actually just going to blend in, just do a, complete switch blend from the subsurface to the diffuse. So if I go all the way to 1, my object is going to be very diffuse and very gray feeling. You can see there is still some subsurface coming through, but generally speaking, that's going to be completely diffused. If we want to look, we can stop this. And something else I like to do while I'm working, especially with something like a model and a character like this, if I'm dialing a skin shader, I do like to turn on some render elements. So I'm going to enable those and make sure, so I've got my GI lighting, reflection, refraction, specular, and I want to toss in a subsurface as well. And now if we go ahead and redo that IPR, we'll be able to see exactly what the different pieces of this shader are doing. So you can see if I go to my subsurface, there is still some subsurface coming through on that diffuse amount. And then if we look at my lighting, I have if I go over here to the more lit part of the model, you can see that the lighting is very, very gray now with that diffuse being brought way up. If I continue, let's go back over to that skin shader, and if I dial that back down, you can see that this lighting pass will actually get significantly darker, and much more of that color will be coming through on the subsurface render element instead. You can see how that darkens down now. You can see also if we had my diffuse at 1 and I dialed my max SSS amount all the way down, that would disappear. And if I look at my RGB, we would have a completely diffuse gray model. The balance, one thing I really want to touch on here is how nicely this shader is really balanced together. You can see my default values are actually working fairly nicely right now. I need to dial some pieces around, but generally speaking, the combination of these 3 sections is working pretty good. So let's start getting this kind of looking kind of nice. So something I like to do when I'm working with the shader, specifically just the 3 levels of subsurface first, is I'll turn down each shallow and mid and start only with my deep scatter. So I can really and I can also just turn off my reflection so I can really see exactly what's happening in that deep scatter. And immediately here, you can see that it's feeling probably too deep. So my radius is too high, so I can dial that down a little bit. You can see how we're starting to get a little bit more detail running through the object. And I can really maybe even go down a little lower. I think I ended up at around 0.7 in that other example. So you can see now we're starting to get some kind of core. It feels like there's definitely some, there's like objects inside of the head. You can see, maybe I can do a little bit higher. And now the medium and shallow scatter, I usually end up turning on at kind of the same time, but I'll usually keep their radius fairly low. So maybe we'll do 0.2 for the medium. Can turn that back up now. And I can also try darkening down that deep color a tiny bit, but I usually like bringing that deep amount pretty high up to really mix it in there. You can see how that's starting to really come through that ear really nicely. So having that intense contrast in radius from the deep to the mid, and then lastly to the shallow. So I probably want to cut the shallow in half as well. So we'll try like 0.05, crank that up. And then now the shallow kind of sits on top of that. And we don't really get any sort of translucent feel on that shallow as much. The shallow, and also I like to, sometimes I'll tint it a little cooler to kind of balance out. So you can see that makes them feel a little paler to have it be blue. And you can even do some kind of yellowy colors in that shallow. You can start getting some really interesting skin tones going on. You can see if I darken down the medium a little bit, maybe bring it a little more saturated, and then I can darken down the shallow quite a bit, and I can start darkening that skin tone down. Then we'll bring them a little bit brighter. But you can kind of see how that's coming together and how these three values work together, which is pretty awesome. Now, if I wanted to blend a little bit more of that, just general skin back on top, I can use this diffuse color, and I can really subtly just blend a little bit. But most of the time what I'll end up doing, you can see how that really killed the deep scatter in this ear. I will usually go in and have a map that distinctly controls where that diffuse color is coming in. If you just have, if you have a constant radius value in here, you may find that the deep scatter is a little too intense in areas like the bridge of the nose. Normally there wouldn't be that much light passing through the bridge of the nose because there's cartilage there. And so you would need to go in and paint a map to reduce either the radius or blend in some more diffuse amount in there. Any sort of subsurface with a character like this can be a little tricky because we're essentially putting a translucent shader on a hollow object when in reality there's a skull and cartilage and blood vessels and all this stuff that's affecting the way that shader would react in real life. So maybe we'll kill that diffuse back down. I kind of like having that red come through. And we can maybe increase that deep scatter a bit more. You can see how that looks. So you can kind of see what I'm talking about. Without any maps controlling these values, we do start having some areas of, like that upper lid starts feeling a little bit jelly-like, and we also start losing a lot of detail in specific areas in the character. So the lips actually have quite a bit of sculpt detail, but it all starts getting softened out by the subsurface. So it's a very common problem, and it really takes a nice amount of map painting to really get this really working nicely. So it's feeling pretty cool. Not bad. So let's go ahead and just keep going down these sliders here on our clean version of the shader. And let's turn our reflections back up. So the skin shader has 2 levels of reflection built right into it, which are really great as well. It's definitely nice having it. So we've got our primary reflection, which is set by default to a glossy value of 0.6. So it's that very soft general reflection across the whole head. I like to tint these a little bluer usually so that they're not just pure white against that skin. See, that was a subtle change, but it's nice. And if we turn up this secondary reflection, the secondary reflection is really kind of meant to be that glossier kind of sweat reflection. So you can see by default that value is set to 0.8. And so if I start cranking that up to just full, which is going to be way too bright, but just so we can actually see it, you'll see that there's that, really wet reflection over top of it. The speculars really need, again, a lot of care taken in painting good maps for them. So specifically like the secondary reflection, you can paint into that T-zone, which is kind of the forehead and the nose, maybe a little bit in the cheeks and a little bit across the lips. And generally speaking, just anywhere there would be that, greasier part of the skin. All right, so lastly, if we kind of continue down these settings, let's set that secondary reflection really low, just so it still sits on top. So there's a little bit of that kind of sheen, but until I have an actual map painted, it's going to be a little too overpowering. Can also dial down some of that primary reflection, and it's feeling okay. So we've got our multi-scattering options down here, and by default, this skin shader is set to ray traced mode. If you wanted to do any of the pre-passed subsurface scattering from the old shader, you can do that, and you do still have the ability to go in and switch between stuff like pre-passed or object space illumination. I highly recommend using the ray traced settings for the skin characters. You're going to get a much more accurate subsurface result, and the way you dial that quality up is going to be in your subdivs right here, which will be directly related to your adaptive settings in your image sampler, so long as you have the divide shading subdivs set to on. Lastly, we do have the ability to map in a bump map and also a normal map if you would prefer. And that's essentially it, the shader broken down. Actually, one of the new section, we do have this ray traced scatter textures, and it's a pretty interesting attribute. I don't usually find good use for it with characters, but sometimes if I'm doing any, like if I have a texture of some other type of object where I want to soften the texture based on the subsurface, you can use this. It does take longer to render, but just as an example, let me find a good texture here to put on this guy. Okay, so what I did here was I've got a red checker pattern, and I set them to be fairly close to that deep scatter color. And on my actual skin shader here, I've gone in and mapped this texture into the deep color. So I get this pretty funny, kind of almost something like a circus character or something. Kind of cool. But what I want to show is that this checkbox will go in and it'll actually blur the subsurface colors based off how much radius there is. So you can see if I turn this on, all of that checker gets diffused out, which is very interesting. So you can see if I took that radius down, the amount of blur is going to be significantly less. So it is optional, and you really can get some interesting stuff going on. So just as an example, if you painted a very hard line for a vein on a deep subsurface pass, you may be able to turn that on and it would soften it, which could provide some pretty cool effects. Maybe, with this value of 0.9, it's blurring it quite a bit. And so it could prove to be negative in certain situations because you're going to just simply be blurring the detail out of your texture too much. So there's definitely, some pros and cons to that attribute there, but it's definitely got some pretty interesting uses. So you can see if I turn it on and let's use that checker, wherever my node editor went, pop up a new one here. And let's shrink this guy down for 1 second. And we can go in and grab these values, these colors, and just see what it looks like. There's our shallow, and then we've got our mid. Whoops, wrong one. Shallow and mid. And we can crank these guys back up. And as you can see, you definitely start feeling that like there's something under there, which is pretty cool. And if I turn that back off, you see that there's just the hard lines across this entire face. I also want to show you how this reacts to, let's make one more checker here. how this reacts to the diffuse. So, if you're blending some diffuse over top of that as well, we map this in there. And we zoom in. Let's just get a nice little zone to work in right here. So you can see our ray trace scatter textures is on, and as I blend that up, the diffuse is just going to be hard and not have that same blur. So you could blur the subsurface layers and then still blend a little bit of diffuse over top of it if you wanted to. Whereas if I turn that checkbox off, everything's going to be pretty hard lined. So just like everything in 3D, you got a lot of options, and those options really start creating a ton of creative control in your scenes. So really awesome new shader, and I just want to kind of walk through the way the shader is created right now, just even in a work in progress state, just so you can kind of see it. So that's this one right here. Oops. So we've got a, so let's get this back assigned to our character. And the big thing that's helping this get pretty close here is the addition of an SSS depth. But essentially this was created, you can see it's just got a black and white area painted for the areas where I really want there to be the most subsurface, and then that's remapped so that it fits into that diffuse amount. So the diffuse amount in the ears and along the eyelids is at the diffuse amount is at 0, and then in some of the other areas of the face it gets brought up to a value of 0.6. So there's actually not nearly as much subsurface in areas like the forehead, and then any of the thinner parts of like the edges of the lips and the nose get the most subsurface. For this, I actually haven't gone in and painted the specific spec maps and everything yet, so this is a texture that Rafa painted for me that was just projected in ZBrush, and this is just getting sent and remapped. So you can see we've got our deep up here, which is remapped. We've got our shallow and our mid, and then this is the texture that we're connecting into the diffuse color. And this gamma correct is actually not an sRGB gamma correct. It's just to kind of lift the colors and brighten it up a little bit, because he was going a little bit too reddish orange before. Lastly, we've got a normal map from ZBrush. This mesh that we're using is the level 4 mesh from ZBrush, or level 5, and this is the remaining detail from that normal map. And then we've got a kind of general skin bump tileable texture that's tiled quite a bit. You can see 75 on each that's going into a V-Ray bump material. And so that additional skin bump is kind of nice in areas. And so you can see it's actually a little too bumpy, so I'm going to dial it down a little bit. I'll try 0.15. I think I cranked that up right before I started the video. So you can see that's starting to feel a little bit better. And let's just do one last quick render over his face right here, so you can kind of see how that's reacting across the entire thing. Just a quick, just so you can see the render times here. Even though the ray trace subsurface is a really amazing thing, it's definitely to get really high quality renders. This is 1024 by 1024. It does for sure take some time to get these renders created. So definitely have some patience when you're working with it, and just know that the high render times you may be hitting are probably fairly normal. If this will probably take 10 minutes or so for it to finish up. There's a lot of complex stuff going on. We've got 3 levels of subsurface. There's a different subsurface shader on the eyes combined with refraction to refract the iris area of the eye. And then there's 2 levels of reflection. So all being done across an object that's around 2 million polygons. And so if you think about it, I'm on a single a single core computer for all of these, or sorry, single proc. I'm on a single proc 6-core PC for these demos, and so it's definitely takes a little bit of time to get it, but once you do, it'll start. The shader can produce some really beautiful results for you. So I just wanted to let you see this kind of come in, and as these last buckets finish up, you can kind of see that nice kind of bump across the top. He's feeling very chalky right now. I definitely need to work out the specular, but generally speaking, he's getting closer. And the last thing I want to mention with this is that the proxy will not be in the work file, but I am still going to give you this whole shader and everything that you see in here. It'll just not have the textures or anything sent over with it, but you'll be able to see how the skin shader settings are set, and you'll have this reference for this lighting and the studio lighting and everything that's set up with. So cool. So anyways, this V-Ray skin shader is definitely one of my favorite additions. The combination of the ray trace subsurface scattering, of course, is a really amazing thing for V-Ray, and so I hope you guys get to have some fun with it and make some cool characters.